Annabel Soutar, playwright of the Watershed, and I'm sitting outside the Tarragon Theatre in Toronto with Matt McCandless, Executive Director of the IISD-ELA. Hey, Matt.
Hi, Annabel.
Thanks so much for being here today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.
So many people have been leaving the theatre after the play, very curious to find out about the fate of the ELA since the events that are covered in the Watershed. At the end of the play, which ends around the summer of 2013, we learn that the ELA has lost its funding, that it has been transferred to the International Institute for Sustainable Development. And there are some doubts about whether the Manitoba and Ontario funding is going to come through and how long it's going to last. So can you tell us about, just briefly, what's happened between 2013 and 2016, and if you guys are on more solid footing now?
Absolutely. Well, the summer of 2013 was definitely the lowest point for the experimental lakes area. It was looking very uncertain, but things went up from there. On April 1st of 2014, the transfer happened where ELA was transferred from the federal government to IISD, and it became its own nonprofit charity, IISD Experimental Lakes Area. We managed to rehire a number of the scientists that were working there. They kept their jobs. They voluntarily left the federal government to continue doing science at ELA. That
must have been a difficult transition, given that it was going to an NGO with probably not the capacity that the federal government had to run the ELA. Can you tell us how difficult that was to take it on?
Well, it was a challenge, and for a lot of the people that decided to stick with the ELA, it goes to show the level of dedication they had to the work and to the science of the experimental lakes, that they were willing to leave security with the federal government to continue working at ELA with a brand new NGO.
Gosh.
But their dedication has really borne out in the progress that we've made since the takeover. We started with a budget of about $2.3 million, mostly from the province of Ontario, and 2.5 years later, thanks to donors, generous donors from around Canada and around the world, as well as new funding from the federal government, our budget is risen by 50% in just 2.5 years.
Wow. Yeah, we heard recently that the Trudeau government had reinstated funding, but if I understand correctly, it's not quite up to the levels that you had before the funding cuts in 2013.
Well, it's impossible to know how much the federal government was actually spending on the experimental lakes area before, because those numbers weren't really published in any reports.
Right.
But
we talk about $2 million to keep the
$2 million.
platform
We
alive.
think it probably was closer to $4 million in what they were spending in all of the operating costs, and including the salaries.
Right.
So we're now at a budget of 3.6. So we're getting close. But it's not just about the money. It's about how effective we can be and how much science we can do, how well we can communicate the science, and how we can influence Canadians on freshwater issues. And you can do that expensively, or you can do it cheaply, and we're trying to do it as efficiently as possible.
Okay. So how is the research going on up there, and how would you say it has changed since it's been taken over by the IISD?
Well, the core research is the same, and all along we were clear that if we were to take over the experimental lakes area as we did, that the science would continue unchanged and uninterrupted. And there was no interruption in the science between 2013 and now, so it's continued.
That's amazing. Yeah, that's in one of the scenes in the play. We talk about the fear of that interruption, that given the value of having done consecutive studies and monitoring of lakes since the 1960s, how valuable that is for climate change, environmental research.
Right, and we all feared that interruption, which is why we worked hard for it not to happen. The science is also, the core science is the same. A lot of the experiments are the same, but we're also looking at what else we can do with this facility. So we're still researching a lot of the issues that ELA has always been at the forefront of, like eutrophication, which is harmful algae blooms in water, climate change and its impacts on freshwater and freshwater ecosystems. We're looking at new and emerging contaminants, so pollutants in water that people aren't thinking about yet because they're brand new, like nanotechnology. We hear a lot about nanotechnology, but we don't really know what it means for water yet.
Yeah.
And so that's
You're
an area
thinking to the future.
Yeah, and It's a great facility. You've been there.
I have. I've been there twice. In fact, 3 times. And I encourage everyone to go up there. One of the questions that gets raised in the play, in one of the final scenes between the playwright and Hank Venema, is, will the integrity of the science at the ELA, now that it's being managed by the IISD, be affected, given the fact that you now have to raise a significant portion of your budget from the private sector? Is that still a concern for you guys?
It's always a concern, and there can be no corporate influence on the science of ELA. That would run against everything that the ELA
But how
has.
do you ensure that?
Well, we can ensure that by how we structure our funding agreements. And if there is some research that corporate interests would like to see done, we have to make sure we're actually bound to the province of Ontario to make sure that the research is done transparently, and that all of the results are available to the public. So there's no withholding of results, and that's often where a lot of the question marks around corporate science takes place, is on where the results go. So.
But that's in an agreement where you have corporate funding. Let's say you wanted to do a research project and you didn't get funding from the corporate sector because they didn't want to look into that area of science. Would that be, in a way, their way of influencing you?
Probably not. The science still has to get done.
Yeah. And
we'll still find a way. If anything, it means that we won't have their views on science. We won't know from them. If the corporate world isn't involved, they can't comment on how applicable it is to real world situations that they faced.
Right.
And if you look at the history of the experimental lakes area, some of the best, most influential research has happened when industry and government have been both invested in the project in fairly equal measure.
Right.
The Mercury experiment that was done was funded in equal measure by the U.S. EPA and the Electrical Power Research Institute, an industry group, and that research, being industry and regulator funded, went on to become one of the most influential projects that the experimental lakes area has ever done.
God. It just goes to show we should stop pitting like one versus the other, like public versus private. I mean, we're all in this together, right? We're all trying to keep our economy running and also balance that with our environmental protection. I mean, why be enemies in this?
It's good to have as many people as you can get around the table.
Yes, 100%. So one of the things, that we also learn in the play is that the federal funding created quite a notoriety for the ELA. It was a bad story that ended up being a good story for the ELA because many Canadians learnt that the ELA existed. How do you today, without that big, story, how do you keep the story alive yourselves? How do we make sure that Canadians still know about the ELA?
Well, this is the type of story that we like to tell Canadians. We like to tell Canadians and people around the world about the science and the exciting things that we're doing. A lot of people know about ELA already because of the work that we do, but a lot of people came to know about it because of the issues around the potential closure of ELA.
Yeah.
And those are the people who recently found out about it, are the people who we really want to get out to and explain the research and show them the cool things that we're doing, and how we can inform them about the water resources around them, about their lakes and rivers and what's happening and what threats they have.
Totally. And this is for me, my favorite expression to describe the ELA is that it's the Mayo Clinic of freshwater science. Like, for me, this is it's like Canada should be promoting this beyond its borders. It is the only place really in the world that you can do these kinds of experiments, and I can't believe that we don't promote it more. Why don't we? That's
a good question. I think that's one that we are very good at supporting at getting the word out on a lot of things, but we certainly can do more on science. And we have to be less polite as Canadians. Yeah, we have to show the world that the good thing about the experimental lakes area is it's not really, the work that's done there isn't about the lakes that are there. Those are 58 lakes, and they're beautiful, but there are millions like them in Canada.
Totally. It's a lab.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's about what the lakes can teach us about the rest of the world, and that's relevant not just for everybody in Canada, but for everyone around the world who lives in a city with a wastewater system or a city with industry. So it's about what the lakes can tell us about the world, and we really do need to do a better job of letting the world know about what happens at ELA.
Mm. So how is having a play connected to the story of the ELA? I don't know, what's that experience been like, you guys? For you
well,
guys?
it's cool. I think that most people in the science world wouldn't ever dream of having being depicted in a play.
That's what everyone said when I went out to interview them when I was up at ELA and meeting with scientists around Canada. They're like, how the heck are you going to turn this into a play? And I kept saying, you have no idea how dramatic this story is. I mean, it really reflects our times, I think, the story.
It's great to see a lot of people that we all know being depicted on stage, and how well they're depicted too, how well their personalities come through through the production.
You're much more interesting than you think, you scientists.
Well, perhaps. But of course, what we really want to be seen as interesting for is the work that we do.
Yeah. Why is evidence-based science so important today? Here we are in 2016, Paris Accord just ratified. We're having big discussions about pipelines. We're haggling over carbon pricing. Like, why do we need this research site so badly?
We need science. We need evidence-based policy making so we can get it right. For a lot of issues like climate change, like issues of the Great Lakes, we don't want to get it wrong. It would be very expensive and it would be very harmful to get things wrong.
Yeah.
So we need to get it right the first time, and that's where evidence comes in, and that's where the work of places like ELA is very important. It provides that base of evidence that policymakers, bureaucrats can use.
So my last question: why today in 2016 is evidence-based science so important? We're sitting here. It's Paris Accord has just been ratified. We're talking about carbon pricing. We're haggling about pipelines. Why do we need this site so badly today?
We need it more than ever today because some of the environmental challenges that we face around the world are becoming more acute. And we don't have time to experiment. We need to get it right the first time. And in order to get it right the first time, decisions and new policies and regulations, measures to combat climate change will be hugely expensive, so we can't afford to get it wrong.
Right.
And in order to get it right, we need the body of evidence that science and research from places like the Experimental Lakes area, from all universities and labs in Canada, produces, and around the world. It's so that policymakers can receive this information, process it appropriately, and make the best decisions that they can.
Right.
When we make decisions, we do it on the best available information. So let's make sure that we have the best available
For sure,
information.
and that's what the ELA is basically so good at doing, because you're doing these experiments out in the ecosystem, right? And it's so rare that you can have access to lakes like that to do those experiments. It also occurs to me that we're very ideological about environmental science right now, and it gets very political. It seems like people are just throwing facts to the wind and just picking a side. I hope that we can dedicate ourselves to the facts again and actually be able to read science and make the right decisions.
I certainly agree. Yeah, we need to.
Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you very much, Annabelle. It's a pleasure.